So let's take a look at the next sample. We're going to be talking a little bit about closures. What happens when you make a garment and you need to open that garment up enough to allow a body to fit into it, and then you need to close that opening back up so that the garment stays on the body. That gets us into the topic of closures on our garments. And one of the most common types of closures are zippers. I've got two all-purpose polyester zippers and one invisible zipper. In the last video, you saw how to shorten zippers by hand using a needle and thread. That's the most common way of shortening your zippers. You can always shorten your zippers. You cannot lengthen them. Remember, the all-purpose polyester or nylon coil zipper has teeth visible from the front of the zipper. The pull tab and the head of the zipper are visible from the front. And if you turn it over, you shouldn't see any teeth or any pull tab from the back. Same thing on this one. There's my teeth visible. Teeth, head, and pull tab all visible from the front. Nothing visible from the back, save for the back of the head of the zipper. Your invisible zippers, however, from the right side, you should see a pull tab and part of the head of the zipper, but you will not see any teeth on the right side of an invisible zipper, hence the term invisible. The teeth are invisible. They're actually just on the back of the zipper. You should see the back of the head of the zipper, and you should see teeth along the back of the zipper. So that is the difference between your polyester nylon coil all-purpose zippers and your invisible zipper. Now, the last video showed how to shorten these zippers, and I have shortened all three of mine. We're going to need the zipper pattern, and I'm going to grab two of these from my 6 muslin pieces. Make sure you've marked your internal lines. Make sure you've marked your tailor's tacks. Make sure you have your notches clipped on the top and the bottom of your samples so that those are ready to go. How you mark your tailor's tacks is up to you. I have thread tailor's tacks on these for demonstration purposes. And I've used my ruler to measure from the top edge of my sample down to my tailor's tack. If it's clearer, you can also measure your pattern, as your fabric is just a duplication of your pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 inches to that tailor's tack. And I've used that measurement to measure the depth of my zipper. From the top of my zipper, you should see 2 tails at the top of your zipper. These are your top stops. These little pieces of metal are the top of your zipper. And then there should be a tail of extra zipper tape on either side. From the top of that tape, I've measured just below these pinked edges. These V-shaped cuts are called pinked finishes. From there down to where I've stopped, I've added my own thread stop, is 7 inches as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 inches down here. So this should match from my tailor's tack, where my stop is, all the way to the top of my zipper on the top edge of my sample. So make sure you're shortening your zippers. If you already have a 7-inch zipper, you should be good to go. I've used 9-inch zippers and shortened them, so I have these shortened and ready to go. If you do not have a long enough zipper, let's make sure you get some longer zippers that we can then shorten. And I've done the same thing for all 3 of these. So 2 polyester zippers shortened to the same length, and the invisible zipper also shortened at the same length. You can see my handmade zipper stops down here. It is imperative when you are shortening a zipper that you leave extra zipper tape down here. As mentioned in the previous video, about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch of extra zipper tape. Do not cut your zippers all the way up here, super close to your custom zipper stop. If you cut it too close, the zipper tape can unravel and it can ruin your entire zipper. You might lose your bottom stop. The whole thing can come loose. And there are some techniques that we're going to see later that utilizes stitching through this zipper tape. And if we don't have any tape down here, we end up losing the structural integrity of our closure. So make sure you're leaving at least 3/4 of an inch to an inch of extra tape below your custom stops, and do not trim the tops of your zippers either. Leave that extra zipper tape at the top as well. So we're going to start with the centered zipper. I'm going to use one of my all-purpose nylon coil zippers and 2 pieces of muslin from my zipper pattern. I'm going to place my 2 pieces of muslin right sides together. And since we're using muslin, there is no easily perceptible right and wrong side. So I'm just going to place both of them together, make sure that my notches are aligned. My tailor's tack should also be aligned. And I'm going to pin this just like I would for a seam, because we are going to sew a seam to begin with. But this seam is going to be slightly different than what we've done before. Now I have copied my tailor's tacks in using my friction pen. I highly recommend you do the same. So right in here, I've copied my tailor's tacks. You can use the thread tailor's tacks to copy from your pattern to your fabric. Once you have those thread tailor's tacks in there, make sure you mark where that point is. It's going to be a little bit easier for these samples if we remove our thread tailor's tacks and utilize just the friction pen. Because if any of these little threads get caught in our stitching, it's just going to take a while for us to remove them. So make sure you mark these tailor's tacks with a pen or chalk before you remove your threads from your tailor's tacks, okay? There's also a notch in this portion of the pattern, so if you lose where that tailor's tack is, you have a notch to help you out. So I'm going to pin my sample just as I would for a seam with all my pin heads going out to the right side so I can easily remove them as I sew. And I'm going to go to my sewing machine. Now here at my sewing machine, the first thing I want to do before I start sewing this seam is I want to change the stitch length on my machine. I'm going to hold down my reverse lever and turn my knob to a number 4 stitch length. I want to make sure that I'm stitching on a long stitch length because these stitches that I'm about to make are going to be removed before we finish our sample. And a number 4 stitch is much easier to remove than a number 2 stitch is. I'm going to lift my presser foot, place my work inside. I am not going to back tack because a back tack is also difficult to remove. So I'm going to make my life easier, and I'm just going to sew straight down on a number 4 stitch along my seam line. Be careful when you're stitching on a long stitch length. It's going to feel like the fabric is moving through faster. And I'm going to sew at this number 4 stitch until I get to my tailor's tack. I'm approaching my tailor's tack. I'm going to walk my stitches, get as close to that tailor's tack as I can. And now I'm going to kind of hold on to my fabric. I may just lift my, there we go. That's pretty close. Get as close as I can to that tailor's tack, sitting right up inside there. Once I get as close as I can to that tailor's tack, I'm going to keep my needle in my work. Make sure to use your hand wheel to lower the needle into your work. Hold down that reverse lever halfway and then switch back to a number 2 stitch, just as we would for a regular seam. Now I'm going to back tack. I've now switched to a smaller stitch length. I'm going to hold my reverse lever down and I'm going to stitch about 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, right around that tailor's tack. So now I have a loose number 4 stitch at the start of my seam, and then I switch to a smaller stitch and I back tack. I need to make sure that I am reinforcing those stitches right near that tailor's tack. Now if this were a regular seam, I would stitch all the way down if it were the center back of a skirt or something. I only have a few inches left of my sample, so I'm going to go ahead and sew it a number 2 stitch along the rest of my seam. And when I get down here near the bottom, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward, put my back tack in there, and then make sure my take-up lever is all the way up, lift my presser foot, remove my work, and snip my threads. So I now have a number 4 stitch at the start, no back tacking, stitched all the way down until I get to this tailor's tack where my stitching changes length, and I back tack because I need to reinforce the stitches. Then I continue at a number 2 stitch through the rest of my sample, back tack at the end of the sample. There's only a few inches down here at the bottom where we finish that off. Sewn through both layers, and now we go to the iron and press this seam open. Over here at my iron, I'm going to do the exact same thing that I've done for all the other seams. I'm going to tug my sample apart, press that seam open, spread apart those seam allowances, and press this seam open with some steam. Make sure it's nice and clean from the outside. Make sure there's no fabric rolling up underneath itself. There we go. Now I still have my notches down here in my seam allowance, so if I lose track of where that tailor's tack was, especially if it was drawn with friction pen, I can still know where that level is, where that tailor's tack was, which is why we have the notches. Now, let's head over to the work table and get our zipper in place. All right, so back at the work table, here is my seam. So a centered zipper, most zippers, will be installed within a seam. Here it is from the right side of the garment. Here it is from the wrong side of the garment. Remember, I have very long number 4 stitches till we get down to where the tailor's tack and the notch are. Switch to a number 2 stitch length and then back tack, continue on, get to the end of the sample and back tack again, press the seam open. I'm now going to take my zipper, my shortened zipper. This is the regular all-purpose zipper. I'm going to turn it upside down. I should not see the teeth of my zipper. I should not see the pull tab of my zipper. I'm going to place that onto my seam. And I'm going to align my handmade zipper stop to where those notches are on my sample. I'm going to line them up right at those notches. If you were using a zipper that had a metal stop, you would place the bottom of that metal stop, which is essentially a little rectangle of metal. You would place the bottom edge of that metal stop just above where those notches are, because we don't want to sew over that. But I'm going to align my zipper stop. So here's my zipper stop. There's my zipper stop. And here are my notches just underneath. There's one. And the other sitting right there. And I'm going to pin this in place. I want to make sure that the center of my zipper is aligned with the center of my seam, and I can also gauge how much seam allowance I might have peeking out from either side. I'm going to pin this in place just temporarily, so this is positioned where I want it to be. And then as I move to the top up here where it's kind of deviating, again I want to align the center of my zipper. I can look for the center of my pull tab and line that up with the center of my seam back here. And again, I'm just going to pin this really quickly. Now, I've pinned through all of my layers, but I don't want to sew through all of my layers just yet. But I did want to pin this just so that it's in place. I'm going to go in here and lift up one of my seam allowances, push everything else out to the side, and I'm just going to pin my zipper tape to my seam allowance. And follow that all the way up along the edge here. Still trying to align, looking to see how much seam allowance I have out either side. Your zipper tape should be a 1/2 inch wide from the center of the zipper to the edge of the zipper tape, and your seam allowance is 1/2 inch wide. So the edge of your zipper tape should be pretty close to the raw edge of your seam allowance. So I've got a couple of pins in there. I'm just pinning through the seam allowance. I'm not going through the front of the garment. I'm going to remove this pin because this is going through all the layers. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, lifting up underneath my seam allowance, pinching that and the zipper tape, pushing all the excess out to the other side. And I'm going to pin my zipper tape to my seam allowance on this side as well. Now I know this pin is going through all my layers because I can see it poking through there. I'm going to release this, just kind of hold on to everything and make sure I'm just going through my seam allowance to pin this in place. Okay, so just pinning through the seam allowance. Can open this back up. I should not see any pins poking through to the front of my sample. I'm going to hold these in place. It is going to get finicky up here at the top where your pull tab is, because the pull tab is going to want to push your zipper tape out to the side, so you kind of have to finagle it and get it to straighten back up. Now, pins are great and all, but we do know that there's a more secure way of holding our fabric and zipper tape together, and that is our hand basting. So I've got a needle and thread. I'm going to use a single length of thread, place a knot in the end. I have waxed my thread. I've gotten into the habit of waxing my thread because it just makes for an easier time. Single length of thread with a knot in the end. And just as I've done before, I'm just going to lift up, pinch my zipper tape and seam allowance, let the rest of my sample tuck underneath to the left hand side, and I'm going to hand baste my zipper tape to my seam allowance just down the middle, just down the center of my zipper tape here. Running stitch up and down, up and down, up and down to hold this in place. And as I get past my pins, I will remove them so they're out of my way. Be sure to take small enough stitches. Your stitches should be about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch long. It will take a little bit longer, but it will give you a much secure finish. Pins as we go. You can see my other end of my thread is catching up to me, so I'm just going to pull on my needle and lengthen my working thread. And again, up here near the pull, zipper pull, I'm going to do my best to keep the edge of my zipper tape aligned to the edge of my seam allowance. I don't want to offset anything. I still want to keep the center of my zipper to the center of my seam, but I don't want my seam allowance to slip too far away because I'm going to have to sew through all this. So it's a careful little balance, keeping those two edges aligned without offsetting the zipper. Again, I'm just going to take one large stitch at the end. I'm not going to make a knot or anything, just a reinforcing stitch. Clip my hand basting thread, and I'm going to repeat the same thing for the other side. My other seam allowance and my other side of my zipper tape. So isolating my zipper tape and seam allowance, get the rest of my work out of my way, and then stitching through the tape and seam allowance to baste that in place. Okay, not the prettiest stitching, but it's in there and it's doing its job, and I don't have to worry about pins getting in my way when I finish up this sample. So we have now centered our zipper onto our seam, hence the name centered zipper. So now down the center of our seam, all the way down. Again, where the notches are is where I've placed, where the notches are down here is where I've placed the bottom stop. And from the front of the garment, you might never know that there was anything there. To hold this in place, however, we're going to do some top stitching to hold everything in place. So we will be stitching through all the layers. We've got to figure out, however, where we need to place that top stitching. So from the back side of the sample, just below your zipper stop, insert a pin through all layers, in and out from one side to the next, just so we know where that is. Try to keep it as level as possible and turn your work over to see where your pin is. This is going to be a great use of our friction pin. I'm going to mark where that pin is, mark the level at that pin, and now I can remove my pin just so I know where that is. And this way I know, especially if I'm working with a zipper that has a metal stop at the bottom, because we placed the pin below this section, I know that when I sew from the top, I'll be stitching below the metal stop, because you do not want to sew through any metal stops. When you're installing zippers, it will break your needle. So again, make sure you place your pin below the stop of your zipper, and then mark on the right side of the sample where that is. I'm going to mark a horizontal line. I'm going to utilize my seam here and line up the seam that I've got with one of the internal lines on my ruler. This way I can ensure that when I draw my line, I'm drawing at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to make a nice little horizontal line across there. And then I'm going to measure out, using my ruler, 2 little squares, 1 and 2, and make a mark. And again on this side, 1 and 2 little squares to make a 1/2 inch wide mark. So it's centered here on my seam, 1/4 of an inch in one direction and 1/4 of an inch in the opposite direction. I'm now going to turn my sample to the side and draw as best I can. It's going to get difficult up here, so I'm going to get to that one later. I'm going to align the center of my seam with the 1/4 inch mark on my zipper, on my ruler. That's 1, 2 little squares. So I'm going to line up this line with the center of my seam. And then when you draw with your pen, you're going to be drawing at a 1/4 inch distance. We're going to do our best to do the same up here. I'm going to place my hand underneath to give myself a little bit of support. And then I can mark at a 1/4 inch. It's going to be very difficult to follow this line as we're sewing, but it gives us a guideline to begin with. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of the seam. Just going to turn my sample around here. Again, 2 squares, 1, 2. Align this line on my ruler with the center of my seam. Draw along the edge of my ruler, and I know that I'm drawing at a 1/4 inch space. And again, I'm going to lift up my sample, place my hand underneath, copy that line up over here. Try to make it as straight as possible. Give us the best foundation for sewing this. Got a little bit off there. Let me try one more time. That's a little bit better. I can see that line a little bit better. So we now have this rectangle on our sample. Zipper is still underneath there. And we've got a 1/2 inch wide rectangle, 1/4 inch wide spacing from the center of our seam up both sides. Let's head back to the machine. Make sure to bring your screwdriver because we're going to change feet on the machine. So back at the sewing machine, I'm now going to sew this top stitching that I marked to finish off our centered zipper. But if I start at one side and stitch all the way down and pivot again and stitch all the way back up, I run the risk of my fabric bunching up as I'm sewing, and it could produce a very messy finish. So this top stitching will be done in 2 parts. I'm going to start from the center of my zipper down here at the bottom, pivot into one of the corners, and work my way up towards the raw edge of the sample. And then I'll start a new line of stitching again down here near the center of my sample, pivot in the opposite corner, and work my way up. Now to do that, I want to make sure I'm stitching as close to my zipper as possible. And you can feel underneath your sample where those zipper teeth are. So as you sew, you can see as I'm moving my fingers up along the edges, you can see where the edge of those teeth are of the zipper. And we want to get close to those zipper teeth. And if I sew with this regular foot, I'm not going to be able to get very close to those teeth. The edge of the zipper is the edge of my presser foot is going to rub up against the edge of the zipper teeth. As you can see, my needle is wanting to sew somewhere over here, but my stitching line is way over here. So there's no way that I can use this presser foot to get this close to my zipper teeth. So I'm going to change my foot. For the top stitching on this sample, you will need a set of finishing feet. You'll need a right and left finishing foot. One will have a notch taken out of one side of the narrow foot, and the other will have the notch taken out of the opposite side of the foot. I'm just going to pick one, whichever one I like, because I'm going to end up using both. And I'm going to install this on my machine. So I'm using the finishing foot that's got the the little notch taken out of the left-hand side. I'm going to remove my original foot. Remember to use a flathead screwdriver, and the longer your screwdriver, the more torque you will have, and the easier it will be to remove the foot. Lifting my presser foot lever using my knee lift, taking out my original presser foot, and sliding my new one in place. Lowering my foot to make sure it's as centered as possible. I'm going to start tightening up this screw. Lifting my foot a few times, center that foot onto that metal shank in the back there. Lifting it a few times, making sure it's attached and it's not going to fall off while I'm sewing. I'm going to make sure I'm stitching on a number 2 stitch because my previous line of stitching was on a number 4. I want to make sure I'm still back at a number 2. Now, which side am I going to sew? Will I start in this direction or this opposite direction? That depends on the foot that I just installed. If I insert my work like this, the edge of my foot is pushed up against the zipper tape, and I would be stitching all the way over here. Now I want to be stitching somewhere over here, but my foot is too wide and it's pushing it over here. Same thing here. If I started from the center and pivoted around, I can't get very close to my zipper teeth. Here, this is about as close as my foot is going to get before it bumps up against the zipper teeth underneath, and I'm not stitching quite on that line. It's a little too far over. But if I take my sample and turn this around, and instead try to sew up the opposite side of the sample, now I can get really close to those zipper teeth. I can stitch right up along my line, and as I pivot around the corner, I can get super, super close to those zipper teeth without a problem. So make sure you're testing to see what's the best method for inserting my sample so that the foot I've installed will get me as close to the edge of the zipper teeth as possible. Now I'm going to start sewing a little bit behind my original, the center of my seam. Center of my seam is right here, and I'm going to lower my needle a few stitches back and then work my way into that corner and pivot up to the top of my work. So I'm placing my needle down. I am not back stitching. I'm just going straight along. I'm going to walk my stitches just so I can be certain that I'm getting to the corner. I'm kind of coaxing my fabric along. And I will get right into that corner. So I've got my work, my needle is right down in the corner that I've marked. I'm pivoting my work. Make sure your needle is down in your work so that you can lift the presser foot and pivot your sample. Lower the foot and then sew all the way to the top. As you get to the zipper pull, you're going to find it difficult to stay on this line. Do your best to get as close to that zipper pull as possible, but your stitches are going to kind of bow out as you get towards the zipper pull. It's totally fine. And as you get to the top, near the raw edge of your sample, take 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward, and back tack your work. Get that nice and secure. Make sure your take-up lever's all the way up. Lift your presser foot, remove your work, trim your threads. I'm also going to trim the threads down here on the top and the bobbin. Now, I've got one side of my top stitching done, but I need to do the other side. But we already know that this foot is not going to work around this corner. So I'm going to change my foot again, change to the other finishing foot. Okay, I'm going to screw that in tight, lift my foot a few times, make sure it's nice and level, give it another little turn to make sure it's secure, lift it a few more times to make sure it's not going to come loose on me while I'm sewing. Get my threads up and out of the way. And just as we did, I'm now going to turn my sample around and insert this so that I can get this little divot in my presser foot as close to this edge and as close to these zipper teeth as possible. I'm going to overlap my stitches. As you saw in my machine stitching sample, you can overlap your stitches and it will secure your stitches. So since I started over here and worked in that direction, let me get this out from under here. I originally started here and worked in this direction. I'm going to take a few stitches back, somewhere before I make it to the center of my seam. I'm going to insert my needle back here and overlap these 3 or 4 stitches here at the bottom edge of my sample. So I'm going to lower my needle. I've got my knee lift engaged just so that I can see where I'm placing my needle. Place my needle there. I'm going to stitch my way across the bottom of the zipper, overlapping those stitches to secure them. Get to my little corner there. I'm going to walk my stitches to the corner, keep my needle in my work, lift my presser foot, pivot my work, and then stitch up this next line of stitching all the way up to the top. I'm a little bit off of my line, but it's okay. Again, once I get to the zipper pull, I may have to finagle the fabric a little bit. It may bow out, but that's okay. As I get to the top, take 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward, and reinforce your stitches by back tacking. Make sure your take-up lever is up, lift your presser foot, remove your work, snip your threads. I'm going to do the same down here, snip these threads on the front and the back. Now, if you were working on an actual garment, you would want to remove your basting stitches. For the sample, please leave them in so I can be sure that you did sew the hand basting stitches. But if you remove these basting stitches, these 2 little tails on the zipper tape here and here would be loose and they'd be flying around and flapping about. So on an actual garment, after removing these basting stitches, you would then go in with a finishing foot or with one of these narrow zipper feet or the split hinged foot and just stitch through your seam allowance and your zipper tape. You can just stitch right through that edge and secure this tape in place. That way you reduce the lift that this has. You don't have it lifting and pulling away and flapping against the body when someone's wearing it, but you still maintain this extra zipper tape to prevent fraying and possibly getting a hole in your fabric. So again, you choose either one of the finishing feet or one of these narrow zipper feet so that you could stitch just through the tape and the seam allowance. Again, isolating this one just through the tape and seam allowance. You don't want those stitches to show on the top of your sample. We're almost done. We've got our top stitching in place, our zipper is in place. I'm going to go back to the work table and finish this up. All right, back at the work table, we're going to start finishing this up. See, my stitches were a little bit deviant over here, but that's okay. Practice makes perfect. I'm going to zoom in so you can see what I'm getting ready to do. So we've got our top stitching in place. It's going through all of our layers. You can see there's my bobbin stitching in the white. So it's secured the zipper to the garment. And as I mentioned at the machine, you can remove these basting stitches on an actual garment, but please leave them installed for the sample book. The next thing we need to do is we need to get to our zipper. We went through all that trouble, but we can't get to our zipper. That's why we made the number 4 stitches all the way down to that tailor's tack. We can now take a seam ripper and rip out those number 4 stitches, and those are going to be much easier to remove than number 2 stitches will be. They're spaced wider apart. There's no back tacking at the top, so they should come right apart. You can just slide your seam ripper right in between the seam there, and then there's a little blade built into your seam ripper right here, in that little U-shaped curve is a blade, so it cuts through your threads. You may find that a lot of the threads don't even need to be cut, they'll just kind of lift away. You may want to go in with a pair of tweezers and clean up any loose threads, just so it looks a little bit prettier. I'm just going to work my way down until I get to that top stitching at the bottom. Between the top stitching down here, the number 2 stitches that we reinforced when we were sewing the seam, and the zipper stop that we installed down there, this zipper should not have any problem with stopping at this point. There's all kinds of things going on down there to prevent that zipper from opening too far. And there we go. If you find yourself getting to that back tack with your number 2 stitches, leave that alone. Don't try to rip it out. There you can see my zipper installed. I can now access the zipper pull. If this was properly installed, you should see your zipper pull. And now you can open your zipper, and it opens up the seam. So now someone can actually get into your garment, and then you can zip it closed again. And if it's properly installed, you should just see the zipper pull kind of poking out there. I'm going to hit this with the iron really quick to remove my marks. Gave it a blast with my iron to get rid of my friction pen marks. So now you can just see my top stitching. I also pulled out all the extra little threads that were sticking out after having ripped out those number 4 stitches. So please do that. Please pick those out. You can use a pair of tweezers if they're hard to grasp. But then I'm going to label this as the centered zipper. Center zipper. And there you have it. Take a photo of this with the zipper closed from the front. Take a photo of it with the zipper closed from the back. And then a photo of the zipper open so I can see that it's properly installed.